and happy Thirsty Thursday already. If you have been kind of absent in the last week, Chris Kern, who is my special guest this week, and I, as well as a few other people in the audience, we're at the Wine Bloggers Conference, but now we're back, and we're back to Wine Antics Live. And our first show back, let's go with that, is all about harvest, and harvest not only from this perspective of the producer, but as a consumer, somebody that's interested in it, maybe a little bit of the romantic parts of harvest and what it really is like behind all of the angles. So let me introduce myself. I'm Jen. I am Wine Antics. My face and my personality is basically all over the social medias as Wine Antics, and I am a certified wine lover, i.e. WSET certifiable, as my sticker said, actually.
You're certifiable in more ways than one.
And probably very true. And my guest, as I said, is That's Chris Kern. So why don't you take a moment and
Sure. Yes.
Yourself,
if you're wondering why Jen's co-host is suddenly beardless, the role of Stub will be played by Chris Kern tonight. Stub is recuperating. Please get well soon. I hope whatever it was that you got stuck inside of you is now thoroughly removed. I am a wine entrepreneur. Chris Kern is my name. Here in beautiful Paso Robles, California, if you can't tell by my lovely backdrop here. I am the CEO and founder of PasosBestWines.com, an online retailer for small boutique Paso wineries. I also run WorldsBestWineClubs.com, where we put together fundraising wine clubs for nonprofit organizations and use small boutique wines from California to fulfill that. You can find me on Twitter at Forgotten Grapes, as I am America's uncommon wine expert, loving uncommon varietals. And I have to point out the wine that I am having right now because it is truly rare. It's the Domaine du Grandjean. There we go. Chateau is the name of a grape. Super rare, super ancient French grape grown only in the Ardèche region of France and the Southern Rhone. Only 3 estates that grow this particular grape, 2 of which throw the wine into bulk wines, but Domaine de Grandjean uses it to make 100% Chateau. And it was not so good up front. It's gotten a lot better the more it opens up. So there you go. Boom, done. Jen.
Yeah, he went super fancy. Like, I went back since I've come back now from California, and I realized that I can't handle it all sometimes coming out of California. I went back to, well, besides the sheer quantity of wine that I went through, there's a lot of alcohol and a lot of acid. So I came back to Virginia, and I'm doing Willowcroft Chardonnay, and it says cold steel, which I assume is stainless steel.
I would assume it's
maybe cold fermented. Yeah. There you go. Look at that. I came back learning wine words. That's what I got from the Bloggers Conference. I sound like I know what I'm talking about now.
What other wine words did you pick up?
A nice
cellar.
That's
barrel.
A little bit more than that. Come on now, Chris.
Sure.
Give me a little credit. So for tonight's topic, we kind of went back to the basics of wine. We've gone to pairings. We've done all types of fun things with Wine Antics Live and blab about wine previously. Now we're getting back to the basics because it's harvest time for the warmer climates, definitely for California. When we were out there, everything was lush. Grapes were heavy and the clusters were huge. And I mean, that's a very, very prolific wine region. Yeah, look at that, big words. Wine region in wine regions in California. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about it because it's here. It's coming very quickly. And it even started in July in California. And we don't think about that. We don't think about that until the leaves start changing, thinking about harvest. But it's already probably past due by the time the leaves are changing. The span of harvest for grapes is anywhere between like July and October, and maybe even a little bit later in some
depending on the
areas.
varietal. I know a lot of growers will hold their Mourvèdre for a long period of time because it's a real late ripening grape. Cab Franc's the same way. Sometimes it needs a lot more heat to release some of those phenols that it can get that give it that green note. So it's really, it's been, I'm sorry to cut you off. It's been a fascinating trend, at least here in Paso. And I know among a lot of the, less northerly regions in California, that really over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's, global warming combined with the drought, but you've seen, it used to be the end of August, Labor Day, maybe the harvest started, went through September, all of October, and ended in November. And you're absolutely right. A couple years ago, I remember some people picking whites in July. We heard stories about people picking their sparklings, their rosé grapes in July. So it's creeping up closer and closer, at least here in California. And that can be a problem because what it means is, certain grapes are not getting the hang time that they need, or with the heat, they're getting a lot bigger alcohol spikes, which means a lot more work back in the crush pad and in the barrel room after the grapes have been macerated and fermented.
Yes, absolutely. And you touched on a little bit of a good point, and I want to show an article really quick. This is Wine Folly's 2014 article on harvest, and it has a great little chart that shows some of the varietals and when they'll start to be picked, because it is, not only weather-based, it's not only winemaker preference, it's also harvest happens based on what you want to get out of a grape, and you have to learn that grape so you can optimize its characteristics going into the bottle.
One of the things I found very interesting at the place that we just were, that shall not be named, was there was kind of a debate going on between different winemakers about whether you should identify a vineyard by taste or by sight. Because two very different situations going on. If you're looking at the leaf cover, you're looking at the bunches and their ripeness, rather than if you're just tasting the grapes. And it's very interesting to hear. We had some winemakers who we met with who, they're out there tasting every day, and especially as it gets closer to when they think it's harvest, as the Brix levels start getting higher, they're going out tasting the grapes every day and doing it strictly by feel, not by numbers. Whereas if you're doing it by sight, you're using a lot more scientific data to tell you exactly when you should be harvesting those grapes.
I loved walking, what was it, Jesse's Grove, where we visited. And the winemaker / owner there was going through, and he could chomp on a grape and taste it for the first time and know exactly what level of Brix. And that's the sugar concentration.
Absolutely.
Correct? Yeah. I want to make sure I'm getting this right too, because you just learn these wine words. And you could just bite on it, and you're looking for a certain number of Brix, and this is in line with the grape itself. This is in line with your preference, because as we know, sugar equals alcohol. So it's certain grapes at certain Brix, certain level of sugar, they start to equate to how big of a wine do I want to make? Do I want this to be a 12% wine and soft and very palatable? And this is big on the reds. Maybe not so much in the whites, because you're keeping them pretty consistent.
Reds? We don't have those here in California. We barely have 13% reds these days.
I know. So true. It's so true. But in France, they don't know what
14% is in France. Exactly.
Well, there's a whole argument we could go, but probably between Old World and New World, and over alcoholing red wines over in California. But I love that experience, that as you are a winemaker, as you're a winery owner, you're going into the fields and you start to recognize what the potential is in your grape just by tasting it. And okay, so every vineyard I went to, I tasted the grape. I really did, because not only are the varietals so different, but you can start to tell yourself, like, just how sweet they are. And it's nothing like commercial grapes. Actually, grapes, wine grapes ready to be harvested are probably the sweetest grape I've ever tasted in my life, because sugar
Exactly.
equals alcohol.
Yeah,
So
no, it's one of those things that it's a great trivia question if you ever want to fool your non-wine drinker and non-wine sophisticated friends, is ask them which grape is going to have a higher level of sugar, a wine grape or a table grape. And 99% of people will say table grapes just because that's what they're used to. But you're absolutely right. It's the wine grapes that end up having much higher Brix levels. Most of the table grapes are picked at, you know, somewhere between 12 and 18% Brix. Whereas wine grapes, you know, you're looking at 24, 25, 26. So nearly 1.5 times what a table grape would be at.
Absolutely. And we kind of touched on a point that I wanted to make, that I feel like, from just sticking from the producer side, I feel like it's this time of year is the biggest game of cards. A vineyard manager or a winemaker could be playing with next year's vintage. I mean, if you harvest too soon, you're not going to get the amount of alcohol you want out of it. You may not get the yields you want out of it. If you pick too late, you may have problems with the weather changing on you. You may also have pest problems, because different things come out at different times of the year. So it's a little bit of Russian roulette.
It's not only that. It's my favorite analogy is, you know, Russian roulette is self-inflicted. This is more like baking a souffle. If you've ever tried to cook a souffle or make a like a nice hollandaise sauce, you know, there's so much skill that goes in, but the skill happens at the beginning. You know, and the same thing is happening right now in harvest, where what happens in April, May, June, July, now you're starting to see the fruition of that. And whether you green harvested or not, whether you cut back on your canopy or not, whether you did vertical shoot positioning or not, whether you let the canes grow and grow, whether you cut buds way back in December and January, you know, when there was nothing on the vines to limit the production, all of this is now coming to fruition. And at this point, there's actually very little that the winemakers can do to, you know, upgrade their product. They do have certain wiggle rooms, and with certain chemicals or blends or, you know, adding in distilled water or whatnot, there are tricks of the trade. But, you know, you pop that souffle in the oven, it's either coming out light and fluffy and full, or it's falling. And that's what's happening for winemakers right now is, you know, they're going out in the field and they're going to know whether what they've got is a puffy souffle or whether it is it is flat and can't be served.
And Christy, make a very good point. It's hard to recoup from picking too late. I don't know if it's any easier to recoup from picking too early.
I would actually argue, I mean, that it is a little bit easier to recoup from picking too late to too early. With some of the yeasts that are created these days, and some of the genetically modified yeast that are specifically targeted to higher alcohol, higher Brix levels, you can take wines with higher Brix levels down. And then, of course, there's the winemaker's secret, which is distilled water, which is if you have a wine that just has a little bit too much alcohol, for your liking, you can always add some distilled water into the mix and lower that alcohol down by watering the wine slightly. It's something that you don't hear a lot of people talk about, but it certainly does exist. If you don't have enough sugar, if you're picking too early, the trade-off on that is what they call chaptalization, which is adding sugar back into the wine. Exactly. It is a bad word. Yes.
Bad words.
Yes, precisely.
Illegal in some European countries to add sugar to your
absolutely. Ask Georges Dubouf or Louis Jadot about chaptalization with certain weak Beaujolais vintages, and you'll hear a lot of groaning in French.
A lot of groaning. I really wanted to say that I appreciate the comments that are coming, not only in Huzzah, but also on Facebook Live. So I recognize you guys out there, and thank you for joining the chat. What else is there from a producer's standpoint, besides the fact that this is probably the most critical time in the vineyard and in the winery? What else can we talk about from the producer standpoint?
Well, the
of
one thing that,
harvest?
and it was interesting, again, being out in Lodi, talking to a lot of winemakers where, you know, they're having the same problems. What a lot of people don't realize, you know, there's this glamour about winemaking that the average wine drinker thinks, oh, if you own a winery, you know, you're out there sipping wine and in the fields and life is great. And they don't realize the wine just makes itself. They don't realize how the wine is made. So what's going on right now is basically 24 hours a day for the next month to 2 months for the winemakers at these places where, you know, they are up at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. to pick grapes until, you know, 9, 10, 11 o'clock. You got to haul those bins into your crush pad. And then at that point, you're either dropping them in for cold soaks, you're pressing them off right away, getting that juice into the tank. If you're doing open top ferments, you may have to do punch downs and have your cellar rats or yourself doing your punch downs every hour to 2 hours. You're moving hoses, you're making sure everything. And this is one of the most important wine aspects of winemaking that people don't realize is sanitization. Is that? Yeah, and keeping everything clean, keeping bacteria away, because a little bit of bacteria, a strange strain of natural yeast can ruin an entire bin of grapes, literally overnight. So it's constant vigilance. It's basically like you're on high alert emergency for the next 90 days to 120 days. It's a brutal time, and people don't realize just how, you know, exasperating winemaking is during harvest. It's there's no sleep. You basically, your back is going to be sore by the end of it, and you're going to, you know, have no sleep.
I absolutely, like, I just watch your Twitter feed for us that are wine lovers, and you do like a hashtag winemaker. I have a friend of mine who's in Southern Maryland. She has multiple vineyards she's visiting right now, going through with the hydrometer and checking the Brix on all of the grapes, just going through, just like care and feeding. Like, are you ready? Are you ready, my little baby? Is it time to pick you? Is it time for harvest? Is it time to bring you in and start the fermentation process? And this is why I feel so blessed to have had so much time with winemakers while we were visiting out there, because we're right at that, like, within harvest time or 2 weeks out. So as a consumer going out to wineries, don't expect you're going to see the winemaker anywhere soon. I mean, it may be very hard to get an appointment with them if you want to go visit. Even if you're a blogger or something, they don't have time right now. They're up to their elbows in grapes.
You're exactly right. It is really the worst time to go wine tasting, simply because everybody is so busy. And, you know, if you're looking at certain vineyards, some are going to be flush, but others are going to be completely barren. You're going to be seeing porta potties and a ton of trucks and cars parked out in the vines from the workers, the pickers who are out there. And yeah, it's, you know, a lot of modern wineries try to separate the two, keep the crush production happening in the back and the tasting room in the front, and try to do some separation. But it's a whirlwind of activity out here, and it gets crazy. It gets really, really crazy. So do not come out wine tasting, people. Oh, and I wanted to circle back to a point you were making earlier, Jen, about your friend in Maryland who has so many vineyards. It's one of the real eye-opening things about Lodi is if you're in a wine region, Napa, Bordeaux, Burgundy, where there's a limited amount of varietals that are grown in that area, you have a pretty good idea of, you know, when you're going to be harvesting. So you've got a little more of a time frame. But the sheer breadth of grapes that's grown in a place like Lodi, or here in Paso, or up in Amador County, Livermore, and considering so many of these winemakers have so many, or these grape growers, I should say, have so many of these grapes, you know, imagine not only keeping track of them during the course of the year, but at this point, you've got to schedule all of your crushes, all of your deliveries. I mean, it's a logistics nightmare. going on.
Oh, yes.
It makes UPS and FedEx look like, Dave's local delivery service in terms of making sure you got workers out on this field picking this one, and then the next day they've got to go out and pick at this one, and this guy's getting this ton, and these people are getting 2 tons, and we're going to keep this block for ourselves. And I bow down to the people the support staffs who keep harvest going. It's amazing such structure exists in the chaos.
Absolutely. Like there.
Yeah, we're the wine.
Yeah.
We're wine geeks. Sorry, this is even beyond geeky. I mean, when you're talking about the actual making of wine, this is not geek. This is nerd.
And it's not like, for me, like when you were talking about the lack of sanitization or one thing gone wrong, this is not a batch of like your 5-gallon carboy that you may lose 40 bottles or whatever you're making out of it. This could potentially ruin the entire vintage. You may not have a blending
Absolutely.
agent. You may not have a single variety. You may not have your best seller. And then if you don't catch it, you're going into the barrel. Oh man, that's even more time and more money wasted in it.
No, it's like how it's why something like the 2015 vintage here in Paso was not entirely devastating, but it set a lot of wineries back because it was something they had no control over, the lack of water and the fact that so many grapes raisined up. Certain blocks, large swaths of grapes were considered to be unpickable. They just didn't ripen. They didn't have enough quality fruit on them. Typically here in Paso, it was 50 to 70% loss of yield for most of the growers in the area. So you have people who, if you've got a 20 acre vineyard, and you're taking 10 acres of that for yourself, and you've got 10 acres of that contracted out to some different people. If suddenly you're down 70% and you're looking at 6 total acres, and you've got to match the 10 acres of those people you have contracted,
who's keeping count of the math here?
Exactly. I think that was right. 30%. Either way, the point is that I know a lot of winemakers who didn't even do a 2015 vintage, simply because they just didn't have the fruit, or the fruit wasn't of a high enough quality. And that's a very old world winemaking style that old world winemakers will prepare for. It is definitely not something that new world winemakers are prepared for, where you have distributors, you have salespeople, you've got salaries, and you're expected to have a vintage out in the stores in a certain quantity within whenever you're going to be bottling that, a year to 2 years. They're only releasing the 13s and 14s now, so they're still a year or 2 away, but it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with price fluctuations given the scarcity of the market for that 2015 vintage.
And all the things we're talking about, so past, water, yield, any kind of changes you make in the vineyard are what lead to the quality of the vintage, the discussion of the vintage. A lot of these things are very much talked about when we're talking about Bordeaux, and where they can randomly have hailstorms that rip through right at peak of harvest time. So it's not necessarily the weather changes drastically, because you're probably not going to hit a lot of weather changes in August through October, except you may get a lot of rain. We get a lot of rain here on the East Coast, and that can really wreak havoc, or hurricanes even, and then hail that can completely decimate a vintage, even if you do everything right during harvest time. If you're Merlot, you just want to wait that one last week to see if you can ripen that Merlot in Bordeaux, and you got a hailstorm
or a rainstorm that sets mildew or mold on your grapes. I know I've heard all sorts of horror stories about storms rolling in, and people getting out there in the driving storm with buckets, just clipping whatever they can desperately as fast as they can, because those grapes will be ruined if they exist. And
Yep.
that's what's interesting is, the southern, the more Mediterranean climates obviously have their own issues with heat and whatnot. But yeah, as you get more northerly, as you get into places like Washington State, as you get into Bordeaux and Burgundy, places like Muscadet and the Loire Valley, not only and it's amazing, not only at the end of harvest or at the start of harvest, at the end of the cycle, I should say, with the hailstorms and the rain, but at the beginning too, where if you have, a fair amount of heat in March and April, and then all of a sudden you get a late spring frost, you can kill off your buds, which is going to decimate your harvest before it even starts. So Cheryl is absolutely right. Winemaking is not for the faint of heart. You talk to the people who do it. It's like, I can't even come up with a good analogy. It's like basically Stockholm syndrome. Let's go with that. It's the torture that you undergo so much pain every time that the pain becomes familiar and you ultimately learn to love it. So winemaking is Stockholm syndrome. There we go. The agony and the ecstasy. And that's the thing is, you produce something so transcendent and so magnificent that people love, and it has a social component. It's like the greatest works of art, and the people who struggle through block and their own physical body limitations to put out art, and ultimately what they do is transcendent.
Absolutely. Thanks, Debbie, for coming by. Appreciate that. And I just want to talk about one other factor that can impact when we're talking about harvest and pricing. Not only should you show your winemaker some love because they're putting in a hell of a lot of work going into it. So when they talk very passionately about their wine, like you now know a little bit.
Shake their hand and thank them for their service.
But seriously, and we're just talking about totally level terrain, like the struggles for somebody that is in a totally level vineyard. Talk about Germany or Alsace, where they have steep elevation to try to keep those grapes in the right temperature and right growing climate or growing range, and the fact that they can't mechanize that harvesting. Mechanization of harvesting has made it so much easier for pricing.
It has.
Seriously, like anything that's low pricing, you're getting mechanized. Now, but those expensive Rieslings, and you start to go ahead.
Oh no, I finish your thought.
Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to talk about it being.
Oh, okay.
No, Jen, after you. No, I was just going to talk about you're getting into a very, very controversial subject, the idea of mechanization, and part of that is because
just drink.
Because you have limitations as to what the machines need to properly harvest. So you have to space your rows at a certain distance. You have to provide a certain amount of space between your vines. You have to prop up the vines in a particular way so that those machines can come by and have access to cut those particular grapes. So, if you have hundreds of acres and are more of a bulk wine producer or a mass marketer, my favorite word, a mastige producer, mechanization is the way to go. But it does take a lot of the soul out of winemaking. But then the flip side of not mechanizing is there's such a limited labor pool of pickers and your basic day laborers. Even in Europe, you hear the stories of the gypsies who come through France and Italy and Spain for 2 or 3 months in the harvest, work vineyard to vineyard, picking grapes all day, make their money, and then go back to wherever they end up traveling from. You have the same thing here in the United States. And we were talking to some winemakers who were talking about just how difficult it is to be able to find these people, to schedule them, and get them to be reliable. So because, you know, they're unskilled, a lot of them are illegal immigrants here. You know, they're over here, they're earning a living. You're not going to be, you know, having them fill out W-2s and W-9s. It's a cash plays business, let's face it. So, you know, you may see somebody one day and then the next day they're not there. And you may have 16 pickers scheduled one day and then suddenly they get a better offer from the vineyard next door and you're down to 2 or 3. So it's a very cutthroat market, and that's one of those things that people don't really think about. Is it scales of economy. And, you know, there's a massive hierarchy going from the billion-dollar owner to the guy on the ground who's making, you know, maybe $8 an hour in cash, humping ton after ton of grapes for 5-6 hours a day or longer.
Because it's a very short window. I mean, and labor is a scarcity as well as water is in California, 2 of the bigger topics that we talked about while we were out there. And I think this is a good transition, because we talked a lot on the producer side. Let's talk about it from a consumer perspective. Now, there are very small wineries that I've had an experience with going out for harvest and actually being part of it. Now, of course, I've been to some of them where they kind of want you to do the quintessential, take some photos, and maybe it's a little social media up, and you do a very small sect of what harvest actually is. But there are some legit places in Maryland that are like, hey, we have 3 acres and that's our whole crop. And we depend on our volunteers to come out and not cut off a finger with those pruners, and you get to watch the whole process.
So
anybody can give that a try.
Yeah, and it's I have had the opportunity to be invited to harvests in France, where a friend of mine, you know, invited me to come out, and I've known people who have done harvest, and his joke is that, not even a joke, his reality is that the wine tourists can last about an hour before they realize what backbreaking work harvest is. You know, when you're hunched over the entire time, snipping, and you're getting in there and getting your hands cut. You got this basket on your back where you throw in the grapes in there, and then you bring them out to the bin and you throw them in, and it, you know, barely covers an eighth of the bottom of the bin. Yeah, the romance goes out of it real quick. But I have to say, for your friend in Maryland, for you, Nebraska, you really need to be careful about the use of volunteers. There was a winery up in Lake County, California, about 2 or 3 years ago that opened up their harvest to their wine club members and friends and whatnot. And somehow they were reported to OSHA and the California Labor Board for using unskilled, undocumented labor and not giving them proper benefits. And right, exactly. And they were found to be guilty. There was a fine imposed of, I think it was like $250,000 on them. Their entire revenue from the year before was slightly over that. So they actually shut their doors because of that event. So if you're going to do that, talk to a lawyer. Make sure you've got it completely legalized. You have the people sign a waiver. You do. I mean, it's one of those things that it should be a no-brainer, like, you know, but we live in a world of regulations and government. And, you know, the worst thing that can happen to a small winery is some government agency saying you did something wrong. And, oh, by the way, you've now got a 5-6 digit fine that you've got to account for.
I'm glad I didn't name any names.
Yes, exactly. State may be rough enough, but hopefully, and it's, we don't know if she or he is male or female, so.
Yeah, we'll go with that. But I think that there is something very nice to bring into parts of the harvest process to be able to be there and watch. I would just say, you know, sorting and separating, and really understanding the press and going through. And these are a lot of watching, not necessarily interacting, but being there as a consumer really gives you really gives you an understanding of how things go from literally farm to table, or I mean, because wine is farm to table product.
Yeah, I like
as well.
the idea of grandstands on the back of a flatbed truck that can drive through the winery, and people pay to observe the harvest as it's going on. But that also sounds really bougie. So I don't know if that would fly. But no, you're right. You know, it is a remarkable experience that I
drink wine while you're doing it too.
Even worse. It's like the final days of Rome, basically. Yeah, it's something that everybody should experience from a distance. There's a great documentary, and Stubb, you can chime in on the name of the documentarian who basically chronicled 2 straight years of harvest in Santa Barbara. I believe it was called Dirt Don't Lie, if I am not mistaken. But it's a fascinating look at exactly what goes on during harvest and winemaking, chronicling 3 or 4 winemakers, you know, and exactly what they go through to get harvest, the late nights, the punch downs, the heavy labor, the sanitization, the dragging of oh my God, the dragging of tubes and pipes and things around. It's just constant work. And it's something that, yeah, you don't really appreciate unless you get out there. And yet we're telling people, stay away during harvest because they don't want you out there observing. You're just going to get in the way.
And I think that brings up a fair point as consumers to stay out of maybe the process unless you get a very selective sneak peek into it. If you get really what I call wine and nerdy with people, they may allow you to see the behind the scenes. But hey, visiting the vineyard late in harvest, like September, October, when the leaves are changing, is a magical experience of harvest, late harvest to go out there for. Now, you were telling me, Chris, that the indication of a leaf, like the coloring of a grapevine leaf, is an indication of its water ability or its water.
Yeah, typically, yeah.
Flow?
That's typically something that happens after harvest, which is during the process of senescence.
After harvest.
Right, exactly. And after the grapes have been cut, it's this kind of magical process where the grapes are dedicating all this resource, the vines are dedicating all their resources, all their effort into creating grapes, which are basically, for lack of a better term, the reproductive organ of the vine. And the minute that those get snipped off, that those drop, the vine feels a huge sense of relief, needs a cigarette and just wants to cuddle at that point. And basically then dozes off to sleep. And it was a nice analogy. So what's amazing is you can watch within a few months that the vines will turn the leaves. The leaves basically die within a few days to a couple of weeks from those grapes getting off. But it's interesting to see. You can tell the health of a vine based on the color of those leaves, where if they maintain a nice reddish color and kind of ease into the process of that senescence, then typically it's a healthy vine that's getting a fair amount of water. If those leaves instantly turn, bright red or black and fall off, that's a sign of a parched ground, a drought-ridden vineyard, and vines that, may not be getting enough water, that could require more irrigation on top of it. So that's something that, if you're going out to your local vineyards afterwards, which I recommend, October, November, beautiful times to get out in the vineyards.
Beautiful time.
Here in Paso, we have our Harvest Festival in mid to late October. So it's technically after the harvest, a nice time for people to come out. Weather's still great, but it's a good time to kind of stop and take a look at those vines and use that little leaf trick to get a sense of, okay, this is a vineyard that's in good shape. This vineyard, we'll keep an eye on it.
Perfect. So I'd say we talked a lot about things from a producer standpoint, from how much hard work it really is, that winemaking is not for the faint of heart, that there are a lot of factors that can make or break a harvest, and a lot of factors that go into the price of a wine based on how the vineyard is being managed or impacted. And then, you know, it's from a consumer standpoint, it's not only it's a good experience to have in dosages, but maybe not the full amount, and get out and enjoy it. But don't expect a heck of a lot at that time. You're probably not going to get a hell of a lot of attention from the winemaker or from the vineyard manager. Still going to be able to taste, absolutely still going to be able to taste, but you may not get the behind the scenes that you want, because it's messy.
That's when you go to your you go to your bigger, more corporate wineries with, you know, the Disneylands of wine are a good time to visit in September and October, because there they have the dedicated tasting room staff that have no idea what's going on behind the scenes.
Those mom and pop operations may not be able to accommodate
or
you,
the Garage
so
East.
Plan
Yeah,
accordingly.
my good buddy Ron Nodder at Chateau Lateau, he, you know, his tasting room in downtown Paso is supposed to be open Wednesdays through Mondays, I believe. And September, October, you'll mosey down there, and he's got a handwritten sign that says "closed because of harvest," and that'll be on there for 3 or 4 days. You know, he doesn't schedule. He normally has concerts, right? He normally has concerts every weekend. Pretty much, it's a no-go from mid-August until well after Labor Day, if not 1st of October. So, yes, you know, love and appreciate your local winemaker. Just don't bother them during this time of year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good place to end it. I wanted to thank you for coming in and keeping the seat warm for Stub, my co-host.
Get well soon, Stub. Get well soon.
Yes, we love you.
And free JoJo.
And
free JoJo.
Free JoJo. JoJo will be around hopefully next week, because we're talking about the Wine Bloggers Conference next week. I'm going to do the post-conference wrap-up and share the more finer details of our experience out there. So make sure to check us out next Thursday. 9:30 is when we start recording, but there's that pre-game kind of green room that I start at 9 p.m.
Sorry,
so
Facebook Live.
Be here before
Facebook
9:30.
Live 9:30 start.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. There you go. That's a good way. Facebook Live starts at 9:30. Thank you, everybody who is in Facebook Live, and thank you to the great people here in the chat. I'm going to try.